Now, the event today is entitled Root Causes of Maritime Piracy. And the premise for the event is that piracy continues to be perhaps the most pressing blue crime on the international security agenda. Today, it's particularly a problem in the Gulf of Guinea, but we also see piracy as an issue in the Gulf, a continuing issue in the Gulf of Aden, in the Malacca Strait, in the Sulu and Celebes Seas, and elsewhere too. Now, a consensus has emerged over the past 10 or 15 years of piracy studies and counter-piracy operations that in order to tackle piracy effectively, its root causes must also be addressed. And that precisely is what we are trying to do with this panel. And to do so, we've assembled some of the world's leading piracy scholars to discuss the issue. We are building the seminar around an important recently published book that contributes to this analysis. The book is entitled Pirate Lands, Governance and Maritime Piracy, and is out now with Oxford University Press. And we are lucky enough to be joined by the book's two authors, Prins and Ursula Daxecker, both of whom I'll introduce in a second. Brandon and Ursula will lead off our discussions, after which their presentation will be followed by 5-minute discussant interventions from our panel of experts. Our authors and presenters have specifically been asked to focus their comments around 4 questions. Firstly, are poverty and environmental degradation the main causes of piracy? Secondly, can international capacity building or naval missions provide quick fixes to stop piracy? Thirdly, what is the link between piracy and other blue crimes? And finally, what time horizons will be required to reduce the risk of piracy? Our presenters will speak for about 10 minutes, after which I will introduce the discussants, who will each make 5-minute interventions. The authors will then have a chance to respond to discussants' comments, after which I will open the floor to Q&A from the audience. And if you could put your your questions into the Q&A box, I will then collate them and present to the panel. The seminar is being recorded and should be available to view on the SafeSeas website in due course. So without further ado then, I'd like to introduce our two initial presenters. Firstly, Brandon Prins. Brandon is Professor of Political Science at the University of Tennessee and Global Security Fellow with the Howard Baker Center for Public Policy. Brandon currently serves as lead editor for the journal International Studies Quarterly, and he was recently awarded a 3-year Minerva grant from the US Office of Naval Research to explore the underlying causes of maritime crime and conflict in the Indo-Pacific region. Brandon is joined by his co-author, Dr. Ursula Daxecker, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of Amsterdam and a member of the Amsterdam Institute of Social Science Research. Her work explores the dynamics of election quality in developing countries and the relationship between politics and crime, particularly piracy. Her work has been funded by the European Research Council and the US Department of Defense Minerva Initiative, amongst others. So without any further ado then, I will hand over to our two authors, and I understand that Brandon is going to lead us off. So over to you, Brandon.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm going to try to share my screen once again. So let's see if this, all right, I got to find, there we go. Maybe that's it. Okay. All right, so let me see if I can get this up and running. Okay, are we good with that?
All good.
Fine. Okay, excellent. All right, so first let me just thank Christian and Tim for inviting us to participate in this webinar. And of course, also thanks to Anya, Stig, and Jessica for agreeing to join us all in this discussion today, this morning here and afternoon in other places. And I think I can speak for Ursula and myself by just saying that we're excited to join you today and to talk about our study and this and the book manuscript that just recently came out, I think in January. So I wanted to go over a little bit about the book, where the research project began, and then Ursula is going to talk a little bit about some of the empirical analyses we do in the text itself. So our study began as an effort to count, categorize, and model maritime piracy events, and it was originally funded by a grant from the U.S. Office of Naval Research. And so we saw a lot of attention being given to non-state actors by scholars, but pirates were mostly ignored, at least by the scholars, conflict process scholars that we were looking at. There obviously were a number of scholars that were focusing on it, but in the community that we had been participating within, there wasn't a lot of work on these non-state actors. And in the first set of analyses that we published in 2013, we noted the prevalence of terrorism studies and the dearth of analyses examining other types of non-state actors, such as pirates, that were being published in kind of mainstream political science peer-reviewed journals. So we thought we might model the piracy data generating process in a kind of unique and compelling way, drawing on some of these models of conflict processes. Now, our initial theoretical speculation focused on state capacity limitations and governance failures that tend to open up space for violent non-state actors and criminal organizations. Our theoretical and empirical efforts were influenced by Justin Hastings' 2009 piece in Political Geography, and a study helped guide our research. Now, Justin examines variation in capacity to explain different kinds of piracy or pirate attacks, kidnappings in failed states, and cargo seizures in weak states, but not failed states. Of course, Martin Murphy in his 2009 book focused on state capacity as a core explanation, both kind of weak law, but also kind of lax law enforcement as explanations for where and when and why piracy happens. Of course, there was a CD discussion paper from 2011 by Anya and colleagues that was also helpful in our work. You know, Justin hints at a curvilinear relationship between governance and maritime piracy, while Anya and her co-authors actually begin to work out this relationship more conceptually. And then, of course, research by Ryan Jablonski and Stephen Oliver, Peter Lair, Martin Murphy, Christian and Stig and Jessica and Ken Menkhaus, and a variety of others on piracy, and work by Cullen Hendricks on state capacity, and Clunan on kind of governance or ungoverned spaces, as well as a variety of other scholars, excuse me, examining the subnational conditions that are associated with violent conflict, all influenced this research. Now, we think our contribution involves developing the causal mechanisms linking governance and maritime piracy, detailing the curvilinear relationship, emphasizing the importance of local governance patterns, and connecting back to the capacity of the central state to explain piracy and armed robbery on ships. Finally, we did seek to measure both piracy and governance at the local level rather than extend some national measure of capacity to the local level. Now, our theoretical story focuses on two aspects of the local environment. So infrastructure for market and pirate activity, and then governance or protection. So the former suggests that pirates need to be where the state is, that is busy ports, anchorages, other urban developed spaces where economic activity is happening, where goods can be sold, even illicitly, and foot soldiers or sailors can be hired to participate in the marauding. The latter, spaces where the state is absent, are places that can avoid arrest by state security forces, but likely also are spaces with little economic activity. So consequently, we expect organized maritime piracy to occur in spaces where the state is weak, but not absent, where opportunities for collusion with local state agents is possible. The relationship between local capacity or governance and maritime piracy, therefore, should be curvilinear and stronger for organized piracy than for opportunistic maritime raiding. So that largely is what we expect to see in the piracy that we examine, and then we explore where piracy happens and the relationship between governance and piracy in 3 country contexts, and then we do some cross-national analyses as well. I'm going to turn it over to Ursula to talk about the empirical evidence.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brendan, for talking about the motivation and argument. If you could go to the next slide, that would be great. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about our global findings. So also in general, the evidence that we present in the book is primarily quantitative, but we do combine it with also some qualitative material, especially interviews, but also archival sources and news reporting. So for the quantitative evidence, Brandon already mentioned that we collected a global data set on piracy incidents that combines data from a variety of sources. This is the map that you see in front of you, which shows you simply all the incidents over time. But then also in 2 of the chapters in the book, we describe these global data and findings. And there, as Brendan already mentioned, we find this robust association between state capacity and piracy across countries where more capacity reduces piracy. But then as the next step, we zoom in and explore patterns within countries and conduct systematic analysis of subnational governance and piracy in the 3 countries that were already mentioned. And that those are also the countries that had the most piracy in the data, in the period that we have data for. So those are Indonesia, Nigeria, and Somalia. So Brandon, if you can move on to the next slide. So to give you a little bit of an, actually one after that. Yeah, so to give you a little bit, just one back, perfect. So to give you a little bit of a, just the one before that, Brandon, sorry, but I need that map. Oh, it's not. It's not, it seems to be not what you're doing. But anyway, I'll just keep talking for the time being. So to illustrate a little bit the findings that we have at the subnational level, using the case of Indonesia, because, yeah, so something doesn't seem to be working. Should I share my screen? Would that?
I'm sorry, Ursula.
No, that's
I thought
okay.
I had this, and this is not the right.
No, if you just go to that slide, to number 7.
Right there?
Number 7.
That's not number 7, right?
Well, I can see we're on slide 6. That one, yeah.
That one?
You can just, yeah.
Sorry,
it seems to be disappearing. Okay,
Aye.
Perfect. That's it. Yeah, so to illustrate briefly the subnational findings for Indonesia, now you can see in front of you a map, and the gray shading on the map represents the indicator that we use to show governance, and the red stars show the locations of pirate activity. And so this is a little bit different from the general maps that we find for piracy, right, where people tend to look at incidents, but because we also argue that piracy starts and ends on land, it makes some sense to also look into where pirate activity actually happens on land. And so what you can see here is that pirate gang members and their leaders are active in places where there's some governing capacity, but we find them neither in the lowest governance places, such as, for example, Northeast Aceh, nor the highest governance activity places, such as, for example, on the island of Java. So this confirms that pirates do not go to the weakest area, but also do not go to where capacity is the highest. And in the book, we then continue in the other chapters to show that this subnational relationship that we established for Indonesia is consistent across the 3 countries, and also is stronger for more sophisticated or organized forms of piracy. Now, we also recognize that this quantitative evidence can test the mechanisms directly. Recall that we argue that pirates need some infrastructure and markets to operate, but at the same time also need the potential to collude with local government or non-state actors. This is something that is difficult to test directly with quantitative data. So to show that these mechanisms are actually what's at play, we turn to interviews that we conducted primarily in Indonesia and to a lesser extent also in Nigeria. So these interviews we conducted in the Riau Islands, which is the area that's historically most affected by piracy. And we talked there to more than 20 former pirates and also some other members of the community. And basically the goal was to establish, well, is the mechanism that we emphasize theoretically also what's going on? And so the first mechanism on infrastructure and markets, here interviews broadly supported that access to markets is something that's important for pirates, that they think about things such as recruitment. You know, are there people that they can recruit from local cafes? Are there black markets where they can sell looted goods? So this is more of a after the operation consideration where access to markets is important, and also considerations such as the division of labor among pirates, that there is a particular skill set that is necessary for the different members of a pirate operation. Now, for the second mechanism on collusion, our interviews also helped us demonstrate that this is a consideration for pirates, that they look for collaboration with the government, even do things such as borrowing guns from them, and that protection from the community, in addition to collusion with the government, is also something that's important for pirates to avoid capture. So locals, for example, would know where pirates live, but do not report them, either because they themselves benefit from piracy or because they're afraid. So now, moving on to the last slide, what do we expect for piracy? And then I'll also briefly talk about what are some implications beyond piracy? So our outlook overall is cautiously optimistic, right, for 2 of the 3 countries. And for Indonesia, I think we're actually also consistent with our expectations, able to show with our interview material that improvements in local naval capacity and better policing on land there were important for the decline in piracy. So this is consistent with the argument that we make about the importance of local capacity when improving that. Now in Somalia, piracy declined only after an international intervention. This is a little bit trickier for us in terms of matching it to our argument, because it is somewhat outside of the scope of our theory to have this international intervention, because we really focus on a domestic comparative political economy explanation of piracy. But then for Nigeria, there, we're more pessimistic, but again, for reasons related to our argument, because of continued corruption, because of continued access to illegal economic opportunities, particularly through the extensive oil sector in Nigeria, there we're much more pessimistic. Now, I mean, there have been some recent positive steps, such as the Yaoundé Code of Conduct, a new anti-piracy law passed in Nigeria last year, but still the progress has been quite limited. And we can see this also in the consistently high still number of incidents, as well as hijackings continuing in Nigeria also last year. So beyond piracy, we do think it's important to caution that narrow success on counter-piracy could lead to substitution effects and could mean primarily that any decrease in piracy might lead to increases in other forms of criminal activity. And some of our empirical evidence suggests as much. I can talk more about that in the Q&A if there are questions about it. And then finally, also, we think that the findings of our book can maybe be a counterpoint against 2 kinds of maybe more extreme ways of approaching the topic of organized crime and criminality more generally. Because on the one hand, sometimes I think we see that there are exaggerated claims about pirate states. On the other hand, sometimes in work on organized crime, right, we see a lot of emphasis on pirates as mafia-like. Now, the evidence that we've encountered in the cases that we've studied suggests also that in addition to maybe some of these extreme cases, there is this large gray zone in which criminals are neither strong enough to govern on their own, but they're also located in countries that are far from states descending into pirate states. So this collusion between subnational actors and criminality is something that we think deserves further attention. So thanks also very much from my side for organizing this, and I'm looking forward to the comments and the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Brandon and Ursula. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists, each of whom is going to speak for 5 minutes, both in terms of responding to the book and to the presentation, but also to speak around some of the questions that I outlined at the beginning of this session. I'm going to introduce the panelists in the order in which they'll speak. First off, we are very lucky to have Anya Shortland joining us. Anya is a professor in political economy at King's College London, specialising in the economics of crime. She studies private order systems in the world's trickiest markets, hostages, hijacked ships, fine arts and antiques. Her books, Kidnap Inside the Ransom Business and Lost Art, study complex trades at the rugged intersection between legal enterprises and the economic underworld. Stig Jarl Hansen is a professor at the Norwegian University of Life Science. He works primarily within the fields of organised crime, religion and politics, including religious terror, and on political theory. Geographically, his main focus is in the wider Red Sea region, Yemen, Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Kenya. He is author of Al-Shabaab, The History and Ideology of a Militant Islamist Group, published with Hearst. Dr. Jessica Larsen is currently a researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, where she works on policy and conceptual issues related to maritime security and ports, especially in Africa. As well as her academic research, she works closely with the Danish Ministry of Defence and Ministry of Foreign Affairs on maritime security and Danish foreign and security policy. Lastly, Christian Bugge is Professor of International Relations at the University of Copenhagen and also one of the directors of the SafeSeas network. His research focuses on global governance and international organisation, the oceans and maritime security, international relations theory, and the sociology of expertise. He has also published extensively on the problem of piracy and blue crime. Anya, I'm going to hand over to you to start us off. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Christian, for getting the pirate crew to sail together again for a very short outing, but nonetheless. I believe this book has some history because I first met Brandon and Ursula in 2014 in Toronto. And then again in 2016, you sent out an invitation saying, we're thinking about a book called Pirate Lands. So I believe that this book has at least a 5-year, if not a 7-year history in your mind. And I just want to congratulate you. I think it's beautifully written, it's beautifully produced, and well worth the wait. I don't know what you remember about that talk in Toronto. You contacted me and said, let's talk about pirates. And I said, yeah, I'm happy to talk about pirates, but I think I pretty much said all I wanted to say about piracy. And you were most surprised by this statement. I said, but you've barely scratched the surface. And I said, well, you're welcome. So the issues that I've always found fascinating and interesting about piracy are exactly the ones that you pick up in your book, Pirate Lands. The question of the root causes. Here we have a problem that manifests itself at sea, but really it is a land-based problem. And as you point out, the areas that are particularly piracy prone are not that unusual if you look at their economic profile. So you asked the question just as I did. So what is special about them? What are the social and institutional frameworks that make some poor, deprived, and exploited areas pirate nests, but not others? As Brandon said, I had this idea with Sarah Percy quite early on that there was a sort of Goldilocks theme around piracy, where things should not be too hot, not be too cold, but there is a just right for piracy. And with my co-authors, Olaf and Matthew, we started to explore this inverse U-shaped relationship between governance and piracy, and same with Federico Varese, looking at the role of onshore elites in facilitating piracy. So I am so pleased I handed over to you, because reading your book, I realized quite how many loose ends my research left. Basically, they were just hypotheses with a little bit of suggested evidence. And what you've done is, I feel you've nailed it. So I'm really pleased. It feels lovely to have this book available to me and say, yes, that's right, but this is better. This is better. So what do I like about it? I like that you take the analysis to the local level. I really appreciate the amazing resource that you've created with that maritime piracy location data set. I might not be using it, but there will be lots of scholars who will. And this will facilitate and enable so much further research. You've done exactly what quantitative political science expects you to do, which is work with fine-grained data, analyze them properly. And yeah, I was delighted to find these beautifully neat, inverse and proper U-shaped relationships. And they completely gladdened my heart. I never expected to see them come out so beautifully. So gorgeous, thank you. And I like that you substantiate that research further with the interviews, because I think ground truth is so much, well, it's so important to complement quantitative analysis. So congratulations on your admirable scholarship. I think it will be widely read. It's a real resource for those who are interested in the root causes of piracy and in trying to create solutions. You've pointed out that there are potential fixes for piracy, which is good news, but you're also really realistic, saying that they're neither cheap nor quick. And you especially point at the problem of, well, you could call them corrupt officials or elites and facilitating or tolerating piracy, but then you also point out that there are reasons why certain people are corruptible. So yeah, I like that you're not judging, you're just pointing out. So going back to the Toronto conversation of 2014, I think you were right. I think I was right. I had said what I wanted to say, but I had barely scratched the surface. And thank you for taking the baton and running with it for another 7 years on producing this book. I was once the queen of piracy, but I feel that the crown has definitely passed to Ursula and her prince. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anya. Stig, I'm going to turn to you now. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's also a pleasure to be here and to talk to all of these people who I included in a literature review that I wrote just a couple of days ago. All of you are mentioned in that literature review. I was also very happy with this U-curve idea, because it actually corresponds to elements that you have to have an operating market and that you have to have some kind of safety. There are some issues. I think it's fun and great to watch how the piracy studies actually matures, that we are getting more advanced and being able to nuance arguments more. So, you know, I probably wouldn't have agreed with Anya that everything was said even by Anya in 2013. I think it's starting to get exciting. I have some issues with the U-curve, though. I do like that it has these elements, but in some cases, you have to go more in depth to understand the local dynamics. Like in the Somali case, if you go to places like Haradere and look at the start of the piracy wave in Somalia, which, by the way, is kind of special because it's more time focused. It's more constrained time-wise than the other areas. If you look at the Nigerian piracy history, it's been there for quite a while. If you look into the other clusters, they actually been there for quite a while, but Somalia is going up and down. And that makes it special. But I guess my main point here is that the free operating market and safety mechanisms can also sometimes exist without the state. That might be at very specific conditions. It might not be important for the big equation that the economists like, but it will be important in real time because it can highlight some areas that are more prone in ongoing conflict situation. But that's also one of the things that I like with the way you think, that you finally brought things down at the local level. So we don't equate state capacity with anti-pirate capacity, which I think is a big mistake. We have to go into the local situation. What I saw in the Somali case over and over again was this idea of building up the capacities of the Somali state, where they didn't even have the reach into the pirate areas, which I found kind of ridiculous, that you wanted a coast guard in Mogadishu and then they couldn't go there because first, it was far away. Secondly, they would be shot to pieces by the local clan. So there was major issues there, and we lack this local focus. So it's important to disentangle the different regions drastically. And that means that you also can look into different types of dynamism. And that might be that you can find some of these governed, self-governed enclaves where you have local governance in other places. They might re-emerge. For example, in the Yemeni civil war, we might have similar cases in the future. So we should be aware that you can have this special situation also at the edges of the U-turn. But I do admit that it's a special situation. I do also, I'm so happy that we got beyond with these big equations, for example, saying that poverty inevitably leads to piracy, etc., etc. Illegal fishing also inevitably leads to piracy, that we have to look into more local conditions. What I would like to stress, though, that maybe we've forgotten that we should start exploring, but it's hard to exploring, is also the agency of the individuals and the role of basically entrepreneurs. And I think one of the most important contributors to the study of entrepreneurs is not coming from piracy studies. A lot of our theories don't come from piracy studies, we have to admit that. But for example, the work of Peter Nesser when it comes to entrepreneurship in the jihadist groups in Europe is actually quite important. How you can have key individuals who expand the this sector by their own push in specific strategic movements. So they can actually interpret the structural conditions and turn them into something through active recruitment and etc. etc. And I think one of these individuals in the Somali case was definitively Afghani. And it's also a concept that I like in criminology, which is called betweenness centrality. Basically this interpositioning between different groups, and you can kind of trace the different groups through the networks through time. For example, you can see Boya being allied with a person from a new region of Somalia that didn't have piracy before, the Sanaj region. Fuad Hananu, he returns to his home region. Suddenly you have a pirate group there that it didn't exist before, and then he's actually the local entrepreneur, so he's basically captured, and then it disappears. You know, the short stint of the second stint of basically Wasangeli piracy in the case of Somalia. So I do think that the entrepreneurship should be looked more into, and that you need to have some kind of idea about this functioning of the networks as well. But I'm very happy that we now start to think more in depth about the role of poverty, and not take it for granted that it just induced piracy, because as you said, you know, you have local basically regions of both Nigeria and Indonesia and Somalia that has a high level of poverty, but actually don't have piracy. So that's rather important for me. I would also say that one of the other missing aspects with regards to the study of piracy is a nuance of legitimacy of fishing regulations and illegal fishing, because there might be that the narrative of illegal fishing had a lot to say for the recruitment. I am more in doubt with the connection between illegal fishing and the start of piracy. And indeed, when you look at the study of Somali piracy, it seems now to be a research consensus that at least in the mature period of Somali piracy, from 2005, 2006, until it started to dwindle down, let's say to 2013, this was of very little importance for the various pirate actors. But then you have some researchers that wants it to be included when you discuss early Somali piracy, basically 1991, 92, 93, 94, until 98, maybe, that it had a role. What's interesting in this period is that you had a lot of ambiguity around what illegal fishing was. And sometimes I actually kind of see a pattern in Nigeria also over this. Basically, you had former state licenses issued by the Siad Barre dictatorship. You had issued licenses by the local entities. You have basically local clans going out and making agreements on their own with external fishermen. So there was a big mess when it comes to licenses at the time. So there was a kind of ambiguity when it comes to legitimacy, which I find interesting, but I don't know the end result. We need more research into the effects of that. But it's not directly legal fishing, because you don't know really what legal fishing is. It's harder to interpret what legal fishing is, was in this gray zone of early piracy and in Somalia. And you might have some similar conditions in Nigeria that maybe needs to be looked into. So we need to elaborate and go more in depth into the variables in order to understand them. And in order to do that, we need to get on the local level. We need to understand that the local dynamics is important, maybe more important than the state dynamics. And it's also something to do with local legitimacy with relations to the center. And we need to understand that basically we need to look into local countermeasures as well. And what's interesting is we talk about solving these issues onshore. And that's a kind of quick comment when it comes to solutions of this. Also, we were asked to talk a little bit about that. I do think that the solutions to piracy is both onshore and offshore. Partly, you can see in the Somali case a horrendous history of individual pirates that has friends that has been lost at sea because of private security guards that started to really grow in 2011, 2012. They started to, and then you actually see a lack of return to investment. And what's interesting for me is that on the local level, the lack of return to investment means that the pirate leaders have less power. They're less powerful at the local level. They cannot pay as much bribes. They cannot hold these large-scale militias anymore. And that means actually that you have an opportunity onshore to put in countermeasures onshore. And it means that it's not so interesting for the political elite to join up with these pirates anymore. And I think we should actually keep in mind that the two are intertwined, that you might have a synergy onshore if you actually manage to have hardened countermeasure offshore, that you have a kind of interaction there that we need to take into consideration if we are going to look into durable situations. And what's interesting
just
also,
to let you know, you're at 9 minutes 30.
Oh my God.
Just as a time check, sorry.
Yes. Very quick last comment from my side is also some of the onshore countermeasures is basically focusing on wider structural issues like enhancing, fighting poverty, etc., etc. And realistically, we also have to keep in mind that these larger structural issues, well, for example, in the case of Somalia, they've been tried to being dealt with since 1991, and they haven't been successfully dealt with. So some of these issues that we often local actors take into considerations, and also international aid organizations take into considerations when fighting piracy, are actually long-term solutions that needs to be worked on over time. And that's something that we should think about. You know, there might be that we need to have long-term strategies as well as short-term strategies, and they too should be kept in mind at the same time. So as you probably understand, I still think it's a lot to be said within the field of piracy studies, but I'm really happy about the book. I'm really happy that you take this necessity of a market seriously, and I'm very happy that you actually have a local focus. I think that's very much needed. Thank you very much. Sorry for really speaking too much as usual.
Thank you, Stig. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks so much. Happy to join today and speak on this important and complex question of the root causes of piracy. Before I bring my comments to bear on this question, let me first congratulate the authors on the publication of their book, a dense and research publication that really puts statistics behind what I would call conventional wisdom about some of the conditions of piracy. Now, reading the book, many ideas sparked in my head, and given the 5-minute time slot, I will limit myself to 2 that come out of reading the book, but that also attempt to directly address the question about piracy and root causes at the same time. My first point is that the blue economy is a policy dimension which needs more attention, not in your book, but generally. It's been going for a decade, right? It's a recognized development agenda that, in short, seeks to promote peace and prosperity through the sustainable use of oceanic resources, emphasizes the economic aspects of oceanic resources, the social aspects of littoral communities, and environmental protection as the last dimension. The blue economy has been rolled out, not least under the auspices of the African Union and regional organizations, along with littoral countries and island states. Now, when you read evaluations of blue economy activities and research diving into its results, there seems to be a strong emphasis on the economic outcomes, so resource extraction, private sector development in relation to the maritime domain. But really, and speaking from the perspective of root causes of piracy specifically, these macro level economic growth is not going to curb piracy. So waiting for the effects of trickle down economy in Somalia cannot stand alone to curb piracy in the Western Indian Ocean, obviously. So the social and environmental aspects are as much, well, if not more important, if the blue economy agenda is to take root, and if you want to see how, if at all, it can be successful in providing local communities and coastal states with the livelihood opportunities and stability that some see as needed to curb illicit activities such as piracy in the long term. Steve already touched upon the relation between piracy and poverty. So these dimensions, the social and environmental dimensions, are perhaps less studied in the book as conditions that may or may not create or perpetuate piracy, nor does the book intend to, right? It focuses on national governance and the level that you call intermediate governance. In other words, I would say that the book focuses on the conditions that enable piracy and not the conditions that perhaps drive piracy. And so with this in mind, my second point is that when we speak about the root causes, I think there's a case to be made for needing to look at both the enablers and the drivers of piracy to get the full picture of how and why piracy exists and persists, and how it relates to and perpetuates other crimes. We need both aspects to sort of sustainably address the root causes. In migration, we speak about push and pull factors, and I think the same could go for piracy. So the enablers, like you describe it in the book, are the pull factors, things like governance on different levels and the ability or the availability of infrastructure to facilitate piracy. You even speak about, in the book, about how piracy criminals gravitate towards weak states, which is a clear pull factor. Although I would actually add that the nationality of the criminals coincide with the state that they operate in. So in that sense, they don't gravitate in any direction, they just operate, right? They don't travel to another country with conducive conditions. So anyway, so that would be a pull factor. And then drivers are the push factors, things that, well, like environmental degradation perhaps is destroying livelihoods and job opportunities, and also what's the relation between marginalization of coastal communities and social movements, aspects like religion or even seasonality and weather patterns also play into piracy. And I think looking at what I would call push factors could be an interesting supplement to the research coming out of the book going forward. So there are many thoughts coming out of reading the book, but for now, in the interest of time, I'll stop here. And thanks a lot for the floor, and I look forward to discussions.
Thank you, Jessica. Christian.
Thank you very much, Tim. Let me start in saying this is an amazing book, and that's not at least for two reasons. First of all, it is a tremendous resource in terms of summarizing and collecting how much we actually know about what produces piracy. Secondly, it's also particularly interesting in terms of how we can analyze piracy. So even if you're not interested in the insights of the book, you will find this to be a tremendous resource for how to study piracy and other maritime crimes. So I highly recommend this for everyone to put on the summer reading list, whether you're interested in pirates per se or interested in maritime security more broadly. I had 3 comments that focus on the consequences that follow from the book. And my first one has actually been very, very well covered by Stig. That is the necessity to actually go local, to think local, and go beyond thinking in terms of state and state capacity, but to more carefully investigate the smaller subsets, the smaller regions, the village level, and so on. And in particular, if it comes to international capacity building, we haven't focused on the local to a sufficient degree. So quite obviously, this will always require some balancing. Sometimes it's useful to speak about the region, like the Gulf of Guinea. Sometimes it's useful to think on a state level and work on a state level. But we should not forget this local dimension. And I think over the entire counter-piracy response, we do not pay enough attention to it. And that's a powerful lesson from this book. And it's spectacular to see how the analysis of the root causes of piracy actually moves us to that level. So that's the first, one of the first key takeaway points for me. The second one is about time. One of the things that you'll find in this analysis is the idea of looking at piracy over time, and then quite obviously it zooms in on the well-known hotspots. But one of the consequences of that kind of discussion is quite obviously that we also need to think about the pirates of tomorrow. Understanding the root causes quite obviously also allows us to at least speculate where we are going to see the pirate outbreaks of tomorrow. And it allows us then to redirect capacity building or other root cause work to these regions. So I think this is a super important dimension, that the modeling that you'll find in this book can not only be used to think about the past, what produced it, but also to think ahead, think about the pirates of tomorrow and what kind of programs we actually need now to address the future, and hence go beyond fixing the contemporary piracy problems. The last point I'd like to flag only very quickly is that if governance is one of the core drivers, or weak governance or certain governance constellations of blue crime, then this might apply equally to other forms of criminal enterprises. And the prior speakers have alluded to that to some degree. And that's illegal fishing, smuggling, and so on. And by now we know that the majority of piracy gangs are polycriminals. So they are not only pirates, but they also engage in other criminal enterprises. And this loop, so to say, how one form of maritime insecurity breeds another form of maritime insecurity, I think is the next frontier in terms of understanding piracy as part of a broader blue crime complex. So there's much to be done and to understand in terms of this broader blue crime agenda. But just to stop here, I think what comes out of the book is how much we actually know about the root causes of piracy, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you very much to all our discussants. I'm now going to give Brandon and Ursula a very short period of time to just respond to some of those comments, and then I will turn to some of the questions which we've had come in.
Ursula, do you want to go first if you have anything?
Sure, I can, and maybe you can pick up from what I've left off, because there's been so much great material. So I just want to say thank you so much for all the kind words. It's always really wonderful to hear that you found something useful in something that we've worked on for so long, as Anya said. And I do remember that conversation, and it's really great to see you again. And yeah, I'm just super happy that you appreciated the work we've put in. So thanks also to all of you, right, for the kind words. I can't respond, or we can't respond, and I don't think should respond to all of them right now. I'm really glad you appreciated how we took, from work of others who had emphasized already some of the local dimensions that we also draw on in the book, such as markets, such as protection, and took these and combined them into a broader theory that also reflected on national capacity, right? So, and try to build this integrated theoretical framework. I guess I would say, maybe reflecting a little bit on comments that came up here and there on some missing dimensions, which certainly they are there. I mean, no theory and no argument can explain everything. But so I think you're exactly right that there are some missing dimensions, including that, we don't emphasize as much, right? That sometimes, you could have this coexistence of criminality without the state. I mean, I guess, Stig was hinting a little bit at the fact that Somalia in the long run might be a bit of an outlier when it comes to, having a long history with piracy. And, there I'd say, one of the things where I think it is useful that we do look and highlight and prioritize local dimensions, but also think about how they might interact with what happens at the national level. I do think that can give us some insight there, right? Because one of the things we try to emphasize is that there is this overall equilibrium level of piracy of what's acceptable potentially in terms of crime. And when you have this extremely weak state, then if criminality can go underway, there is not much to stop it, right? So from that perspective, I think, we can explain some of the dynamics that play out somewhat differently across the three cases. But I think, I would just say that. I mean, I appreciated the point on entrepreneurs and that there might be these networks and these individuals that are especially important. I think that's fantastic. I think that's also, I found that in material on Nigeria, right? The godfathers are, are these incredibly important actors, not just for piracy, but also for other forms of criminal activity and corruption in Nigeria. So I think that would be something, very much to take on board moving forward. I'd say, in this discussion, on like, okay, are there additional specific dimensions or issues that we should have included? I very much agree on the one hand. On the other hand, I'd also say it's always a trade-off between specificity and at the same time, perhaps also wanting to be able to show, okay, there is this relationship that exists systematically and consistently, and we can show it in a number of cases, which we thought, is a useful contribution also, because we had these incredible studies, right, on Somalia, such as, the work of Anya and Stig's work, but what we didn't have is, showing similar things in other cases, and also, thinking about it more from, how can we come up with an integrated theoretical framework to explain that. I mean, I guess one last point on, responding to Jessica's comment, I think, and also Christian hinted at it on this question of enablers versus drivers. I think you're very right that we, put forward more of a opportunity or, constraints type explanation. I would say that they're not entirely divorced from drivers, right? Because if we think about what an institutional environment that, these kind of spaces of criminality, if you will, which I think is exaggerating what happens, but I think in the Riau Islands, which is, the area where we did the interviews, I think there is something to say about that going on. I think we do see that the institutional environment also fosters, or has an effect on drivers. So I wouldn't say that they're entirely, independent from each other. So I'll leave it at that and hand over to Brendan. And I probably already went on for too long, so sorry about that, Tim.
Again, thank you to everyone for their comments, and Ursula, you've actually addressed much of. Oh, I'm here, right? You can hear me.
We can hear you.
Much of what I wanted to say in the first place. Thank you for all these comments. I would just say that I would agree with Jessica that we certainly privilege these pull factors rather than the push factors in the text itself, and that I do think there probably could be some more attention to the push factors, and maybe something like IUU fishing, although you didn't note that, but it falls along the line of the overexploitation of marine resources that might be a push factor that a number of scholars are examining now, and Christian has obviously noted some concerns with. And of course, I appreciate Christian's comments regarding connections between various blue crimes that are happening. And certainly Stig's comments regarding policy entrepreneurs or political entrepreneurs, it would be interesting to look at this. We don't really have any attention to the importance of individuals in driving predation or piracy attacks. I think it's interesting that we have some evidence regarding social movements about the role of individuals and what happens with a strong individual to that movement. If in fact the movement is based on a strong individual, and maybe the movement doesn't last after that individual leaves, right? So something about the structure of the organization has to exist for that organization to actually last longer than the person who perhaps set it up or is so important in instigation. I think that might be quite interesting, but it might explain the Afweni example where this individual who was located around him, and once he's gone, some of that actually goes away as well. So I do think it'd be interesting to explore that as well. I'll stop there. Thank you very much again for all of your comments. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Ursula. Thank you to everybody. So we've had really quite a number of comments come in, and my job is to try and organize and cohere them and put them to the panel. At the moment, I have, I think, probably 7 or 8 categories of question that have come in. So I'm going to start. I'm going to present 4 of these, and then I will ask the panel to respond in the order that they have presented. And then we can revisit some of the other questions as well. So if we don't get to your question immediately, it doesn't mean we've forgotten about you. It just is in terms of the order of which questions come through. So the first of these relates to a very immediate problem that we all face at the moment, and that is, do you think that COVID and the crisis after will lead or contribute to a number of piracy incidents? So the question about COVID. The second question, and there are some related questions coming around this, really relates to governance and capacity, and it actually concerns a question I had myself. And the question that I'm going to lead with on this is, did the return of an internationally recognized government in Somalia have any consequences on the decline of piracy over the past decade? Now, for me, that raises a wider question about what kinds of capacity, in terms of the capacity you talk about in the book, are important in relation to the fight against piracy. Is that in relation to, for example, maritime enforcement capacity? Is it in relation to law enforcement and criminal investigation on on land? Or is it in relation to wider governance and institutionalization issues more broadly, whether that be at a state level, at a regional level, or more locally, as Christian was suggesting? That then relates, I think, to a third question, which concerns the land and sea boundary in terms of counter-piracy activities. A question I've had come in. Sorry, I'm just trying to keep on top of where the questions are. So, what is the specific role of maritime security responses within this? If the problems are rooted on land, where does the maritime fit in? How do those two things cross over? So I think broadly, let's leave it at COVID, governance and capacity building, and land-sea boundaries. I will hand over to the panel, and if we start with Brandon, we'll go through in the order that you initially presented.
Thanks very much, Tim. So you said me first, right? Is that what you said? Yeah, all right. So I'll just say one thing about COVID, and somebody else wants to address something. So I think there is some speculation about whether or not the economic fallout from COVID will have some effects on maritime crime. We certainly saw increases in piracy after previous economic crises, kind of global economic crises, the Asian financial crisis, was followed by an increase in piracy in Southeast Asia. The global financial crisis in 2007, 2008 was followed by an increase in piracy after that as well. So there is this hypothesis about whether or not the economic fallout from COVID will have some similar effects in spaces. I mean, the WTO certainly expects every country, I think, in the world other than China to actually economically contract in 2020, and some countries quite significantly. They expected Nigeria, something like 10 million additional Nigerians will be pushed into poverty as a consequence of the COVID pandemic and the oil crisis that are happening at the same time. It's not yet clear. I mean, there certainly was an increase globally in piracy in 2020. Some speculate that COVID had some effect on that. Whether or not we continue to see that in 2021 is certainly a question. I'll stop with that. I don't know if Ursula, you want to address either the governance one or.
Sorry, do we choose which question to address?
I think so. I think if we all go through each of the questions, we'll still be talking at 3 o'clock. So please choose which you'd like to respond to.
Yeah. Well, I guess I can respond to the one on, okay, land and sea, the boundary. Do we have to have an integrated solution focusing on various forms of maritime crime at the same time? I mean, yeah, I think I would agree. I mean, the key question that I think is still somewhat unanswered, and Christian in his comments highlighted that, right? Whether, we see different forms of maritime crime occur in the same spaces because they respond to the same underlying factors or causes, right? They're kind of co-produced by similar dynamics, and might also be a result of, maybe similarly favorably geographic conditions, or whether it's more of a substitution effect, which is what we found a little bit in our interviews, that people we talked to, they had stopped being engaged in piracy, or at least they told us that they had stopped. And I mean, it seemed reasonably convincing, but they had moved on to other kind of criminal activity. And yeah, I think, in our book, we couldn't address that question fully. Is it more of a question that, like smuggling, piracy, i.e. fishing, they're kind of driven by the same underlying factors? Or is it also that, an increase in piracy would then lead to other people becoming involved in other forms of maritime crime? I don't think we could really answer that question. So I think we need more work on that. But my guess is, I mean, it could also be both, right? They're also not mutually exclusive. But I don't think I found a lot of evidence that would suggest, for example, that an increase in piracy on its own would lead to an increase in illegal fishing. And there's some new recent work that kind of makes that claim. But there, I think, that there's some concerns about, these underlying conditions affecting both, that I think makes it difficult for us to speak to that. I mean, if we have time, I might come back on the COVID question, but I also realize we have a large panel, so sorry.
Thank you, Ursula. Anya.
Thank you for these questions. I will have a look at the COVID one, because what really interested me there was that it's not just a question of an economic decline, but a fundamental redefinition of what people think they can expect from their governments and the amount of loyalty that they have for their government. So what I see in a lot of countries that have been hit hard by COVID is that there has been a massive reduction in the trust in government, and a reliance on local forms of grassroots governance in meeting the immediate needs of people whose livelihood and health has been impacted so badly. But super interestingly also, the way that organized crime groups have stepped into the void that governments have left, and who have themselves, particularly in South America, have organized an amazing response to help people cope with the crisis by imposing curfews, by distributing food, by getting access to medical care, really out-governing governments. So in terms of the outfall of COVID on crime, I think if we see a reduction in trust in government and therefore also a reduction in the adherence of people to law, we might well see a lot more crime in the aftermath. Not just because people have more needs that they can more easily fulfill with criminal activity, but also because somehow organized crime comes out of this crisis with more credibility than governments.
Thank you, Anya. Stig.
Yes, I think I will just comment upon 3 issues. One of the questions who is interesting here is the return of the Somali government. And then yesterday, as you probably heard, the president of Somalia is rather isolated in Mogadishu, and you really have all the regional states saying that they won't accept his extension of terms. And this is a little bit symptomatic, because in the areas we talk about, there is not that much of reach of the Somali government. If you talk about the Galmudug area and if you talk about the Puntland, you know, the Somali government is not even today that important. It set a kind of legal setting, and in the past the Somali government wasn't that decent in handling the pirates that even invested in Mogadishu. For example, Mohammed Gafanje, who they maybe arrested and released without any form of legal procedure whatsoever, for some reason. We don't know that reason, maybe clap. So the Somali government in relations to piracy has been of limited importance, but the local government is very important here. So you can see that, for example, the Puntland government have serious issues before the spike in piracy in 2007, 2008, that you actually have a lack of payment to the police coming out from the central authorities in the Puntland regional state, and the police almost collapsing onshore while it's going bad offshore as well. But this is a regional entity, and at times today, it's heavily in opposition with the presidency. I also want to make some quick comments. Firstly, when it comes to illegal fishing, we should be honest with ourselves and take into consideration that some of the major actors within illegal fishing in the areas that we're talking about, in both Nigeria and Somalia, are actually coming from the global north. They're quite resource strong. Some of them comes out of Spain, some of them comes out of Portugal, some of them comes out of Taiwan, some of them comes out of South Korea. So we should keep that in mind. You know, if there is a kind of correlation, very often maybe there's a spurious effect of something that creates victims rather than actors. And this is something that we should keep very strongly in mind. Yeah, that's basically my 2 short comments on the 2 selected questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Stig. Jessica.
Yes, all right. So I think a lot has already been said about the issues, but if I turn to the one on the land-sea boundary and maritime security responses, I think there's something about the way that we often frame the problem, and this is about the relation between maritime security and piracy, which implies like a cause and effect. Like maritime security is shipping and seafarers, and piracy is what prevents it, right? Prevents security. But that's of course treating the proverbial symptom and dealing with piracy by patrolling the sea is like police roaming the streets for pushers, hoping that drug markets and addictions will go away. So we call it counter-piracy and maritime security, but really we know that piracy to a large extent is born out of social issues on land, and some of them have been documented in the book. So I think we need, or we could reframe the problem to really get at the root causes. And here I'm back at the root causes again. If we want to get at the root causes, I think we need to think about maritime security as something much wider, which starts not with patrolling the sea and maritime domain awareness and capacity building and exercises and training. In fact, we probably need to bring piracy and tackling its root causes out of the security discourse altogether, and that's why I was talking about the blue economy earlier on. So like a developmental framework version 2.0 with a wider notion of sustainability. But obviously, like we saw off the coast of Somalia that naval missions and maritime security interventions did work, although there are also a lot of other factors behind the scenes that, of course, have contributed to the decline in piracy. Well, I can just maybe, about 5 years ago, I did interviews with Somalis convicted of piracy that were incarcerated in the Seychelles. And I mean, statistically, it was just worth the risk to launch piracy attacks for them. I think what's more important from an international perspective is prosecution. And I usually try to talk about prosecution, because if there's no legal finish, then obviously there's, well, it's kind of a waste of resources to have ships patrolling. And I think for the Somalis that I interviewed, when their friends started not coming home again because they were being apprehended, I think that's when the gravity started to sink in. So that's also very important when you go forward with counter-piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, where European navies are now, to a large extent, sending warships. Yeah, so that was a little bit about maritime security. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. And finally, Christian.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I'd like to pick up one earlier comment from Brandon first, which is the question of entrepreneurs, criminal entrepreneurs as one of the core drivers, and quite obviously to run a pirate organization, you need to have quite some not only criminal energy, but also good ideas of how to do it, and some logistical skills and so on. And Brandon, you alluded to the literature on social movements. But there's also another literature, which is the literature on targeted killings and also targeted sanctions. And I think what comes out of that literature is actually that if you if you kill the leader of or high-level leader in a terrorist network, the network in itself does not necessarily go away. So I think that clearly comes out of that literature. So it might be something in addition to look into, and I think it also has policy relevance, because there's a silent assumption both in the Somalia discussion as well as in the Nigeria discussion that if we finally catch the kingpins, then the risk of piracy will significantly reduce, and we might want to encounter that argument as researchers. Very quickly on the land-sea nexus, a lot of stuff has been said here. Paradigmatically, the book is actually called Pirate Lands, not Pirate Seas or Pirate Waters. I wish it would have been called Pirate Lands at Sea or something like that, to flag that quite obviously both of it is important. And what we're looking here at is a multi-level problem. We need to think regionally, we need to think nationally, we need to think locally, but the same goes for land and sea. And quite obviously, Jeffrey Till has this beautiful concept that what matters is actually good order at sea, and that we need to address the bad orders. So it's partially a useful way of thinking, but then the sea is never a very orderly space to start with. It moves and so on. But quite obviously, it has a lot to do with how the law, in more general terms, is being enforced at sea. And there's also the research on the broken window theory that clearly shows that even these small violations might over time actually incrementally lead to larger forms of crime. So we also need to think about these small violation as a starting point for other forms of maritime crime. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Christian. Stig, you have your hand raised. Could you make it a very brief comment, Stig, please?
Yes, I think entrepreneurship will have different effects according to different periods of time within the development of piracy. What we saw with Afghani is that he was crucial in gathering a lot of people around him. When his pirate outfits kind of collapsed, those people spread home to their own areas. So they kind of disappeared back, and you got a lot of other pirate outfits. So after that position, the damage of Afghani was to a certain extent done, and he was important, but he wasn't that important anymore. So we have to look into the entrepreneurship about it might have different roles in different periods of time in the trajectory of local piracy development. Yeah.
Thank you, Stig. We have time, I think, for one more round of questions. As always, I'm going to completely overload the question session with questions because you've had so many fantastic ones come in. So if the panel can address them as they would like to, that would be very helpful. The first of these questions concerns issues, I suppose, of coordination in counter-piracy responses. And this, of course, relates to the question of interlinkages between different crimes as well. So the question on transboundary stakeholder engagement between government and non-government. But I think I would ask you to reflect on the importance of coordination in relation to both the issues, so the various kinds of crimes involved, the institutions within states that need to coordinate to tackle those crimes, both on land and sea, coordination within regions, and then perhaps the necessity of coordinating across public and private. So I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on on the significance of coordination across those areas and how that can be facilitated. There's a second question from Tim Walker at ISS around the point about pirates of tomorrow. And Tim actually provides some really interesting analysis in his question, which we don't have time to read out entirely, but the panel should be able to see. But he notes that many of the causal factors you identify in your findings, Ursula and Brandon, are at play now in Mozambique, local governance conditions, geography, maritime smuggling, for instance. And he asks whether there are similarities between Mozambique now and Somalia in 2007 and 8. And I suppose the wider question here is, how should we use your analysis to look forward to where the pirates of tomorrow might come from? What are the implications of that? Finally, we have a question on, I guess, pirate business models from Alexander Sewell. And I am going to read this out, or at least part of his question. He's been doing some research with pirates, including interviews with pirates in the Gulf of Guinea. And he says, what struck me was the diminishing links to communities and diminishing links to communities and markets, but strengthening links to sponsors or elites who are often outside the region, perhaps linked to the shift from oil to kidnap for ransom. So he asked, did the research encounter this elsewhere? So the question is what are business models shifting perhaps in the way that Alexander suggests? And then actually I will slip in one final question, which I think brings us to rounds off all the questions we've had in so far. And that's specifically for Christian. And it says, it asked about the intersections between your work on the blue crime concept and whether or not blue crime can help us analyze and solve some of these issues that have come up here today. So I'm going to leave it at that. And now I'm going to hand over to our panel to respond. And I think that will take us through to the end of the webinar. So I'll start again with you, Brandon, and we'll proceed through in the same order that we did to start with.
Thanks very much, Tim. Again, a lot of really interesting questions. I'll simply say something brief about the counter-piracy coordination, transboundary issues. So obviously, there have been a variety of cross-national efforts to address maritime piracy in Southeast Asia in particular. So the Malacca Straits patrol, aerial surveillance, Thailand joins this in 2009 after the ceasefire in Aceh in 2004. All of this actually does contribute to a decrease in piracy. Also, some coordinated patrols that are happening in the Sulu and Celebes Seas that have had some effect on decreasing piracy coming from the southern Philippines. So clearly that type of multinational effort is critical for addressing maritime piracy, particularly in spaces in which pirates can easily flee across borders, preventing what might be hot pursuit. Obviously, Southeast Asia poses some additional hurdles, in part because of the maritime issues that are challenging among these states, right? So there are certainly concerns about these issues leading to escalation among some of these countries. So there are certainly concerns about some of these forces actually transiting across boundaries, contributing to some concerns by other states like China. And also I'd say, I think in Indonesia, in terms of within government coordination, I think there are something like 7 or 8 organizations or agencies within the government that have some jurisdiction over maritime security issues. And so trying to get coordination across those different organizations is obviously a challenge as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Brandon. Ursula.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'll say one thing very briefly about Tim Walker's question about Mozambique. I think that's a fascinating question. I don't think I'm in a great position to answer it because I just don't know enough about the Mozambican context. I think the crucial question for me would be, is there a similar opportunity zone for piracy close to the coast, right? So I simply don't know enough about whether there is extensive ship traffic passing that would create opportunities, or whether there is the oil sector similar to, for why we see, I think, a lot of what's happening in Nigeria, right? I think without the oil industry, Nigeria probably wouldn't have a piracy problem in the first place. So I think that would matter here. And you, Tim, I mean, probably know more about that than I do. I do want to say something about the question on the pirate business model by Alexander Sewell. I think it's such a terrific question. Actually, I would love to connect with you and talk with you about your findings, because I'm already jealous that you've managed to interview 40 pirates in Nigeria. I connected with some great experts there, but I wasn't able to even travel to the region. And I mean, well, that would have been feasible, but I think the interviews, I was told that this would be too difficult. So I'd love to hear how you managed to do this. I think it's very interesting what you say. I think it somewhat confirms what people have also told me. And what I've been reading is that increasingly pirates in the region have this very coercive relationship, both with the community, and they might continue that relationship with pirates only, or other militants as well, only because the relationship with the government is similarly troubled. So they know, right, if they went to the government, then things wouldn't get better, things might even get worse. It's interesting that they're now, the pirates are now turning to other actors. I'm curious how long-term sustainable that would be, because there I would wonder, I've heard, right, that the geography of the region is complicated enough that you really do need a lot of local knowledge and expertise. And I wonder if the connections are increasingly only with outsiders, whether that could create some problems in the long term. But anyway, I'm saying also I'd love to connect with you and talk more.
Thank you, Ursula, sorry. Brandon, you had your hand raised. Is it a very quick intervention?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to follow up with Ursula on Mozambique thing and Tim's question. I just wanted to say that I was somewhat surprised that there was so little piracy coming off of Mozambique, given the conditions that are quite similar to other spaces in which you actually see quite a bit of piracy. I do wonder if, because of the Somali example and because of the CTF 151 and the EU mission, that there actually now is some expertise in addressing it, some attention to piracy. And so the expectation that you will see an explosion of piracy off of Mozambique is probably less likely now, in part because of the experience with Somalia. Perhaps without Somalia, maybe you would have seen more of an explosion, but I do wonder if the international community is now primed to address this in a more significant way than it was prior to that.
Thank you, Brandon. Anya.
Yeah, I want to talk quickly about the coordinating counter-piracy responses. So I think I'm probably treading on Christian's turf here, but I had the impression that learning how to coordinate and creating institutions for cooperating within the European Union, and also for creating channels of communication with former adversaries such as China and Russia, almost became a project in itself. That piracy was an excuse for trying to build new ways of cooperating that could be used and channeled elsewhere, and were engaged upon with some enthusiasm. About the business model, I'm also interested. I like how people do things. I would be interested to find out more about whether, on which dimension there is cooperation, because is it about labor, is it about finance, or is it about social capital, or is it about know-how? There is some history of the Somali diaspora being involved in funding pirates at some stage, not terribly well backed up, but certainly anecdotal evidence. But I haven't seen anything about labor being hired in from elsewhere, or that you can buy protection from outsiders. So yeah, I don't know, but I'd be again interested to find out more.
Thank you, Anja. Stig?
Yes, I would just say when it comes to government and non-government coordination, one of the issues, I don't know if I answered this directly, but one of the issues that is important for me is this legitimacy discrepancy also in Nigeria, where you have local institutions and you have local governments hijacked by specific elites, so it doesn't necessarily reflect local opinions at all. And then you have a state level who doesn't really reflect legitimacy at the regional level. So you have different levels and you have different levels of legitimacy. And what you need to ensure when you coordinate is also that you have these voices at the local level. So you need to ensure that you actually are coordinating with institutions that has legitimacy at the local level. And it's not a direct answer, but it's my comment to that. I think that also I need to study Mozambique more, but to answer the Mozambican question, if I interpretate the work of Anja and Ursula, maybe I would say that if it's too much fighting there at the time, then it will upset logistical operations of piracy. So we are asking ourselves if Mozambique is where maybe Somalia was in 2007. Maybe it's where Somalia was in 1993, 1994. So maybe it has some potential depending on where this goes in the future, where actually the pirates can access markets more easily, where they can bring safety to the logistical lines. But maybe the fighting now it's too intensive. And I'm also very interested in the comments on Nigeria. You know, my first inclination is to ask, you know, are there some kind of ethnic connections between the elites? Do we talk about Lagos? And what's interesting about Lagos is that, of course, it has its kind of separate piracy tradition that was separate from the Delta in the older times. And then it kind of dwindled down. It's still there, but it's not as big as it used to be. And is there then connections to the old Lagos piracy elite? And I just give questions because it's really a very interesting observation. So I didn't answer any question. I just asked new questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Stig. Jessica.
Yes, very briefly on the coordination question, and coordination is stressed as important, and all policy readings has this as a chorus, and it's done or it's attempted at various levels within counter-piracy infrastructures in specific regions, and I think Gulf of Guinea is a prime example of this with the own code of conduct, and we still need to understand better how this actually works. Anja already said that coordination became kind of a project in and of itself, and I very much agree with that. But adjacent to coordination is information sharing and actual cooperation around maritime law enforcement and counter-piracy operations. So by no means coordination is the only issue for effective counter-piracy. One problem about capacity building, for example, is that programs are short-term and are not sufficiently anchored in the regional states, including political awareness. I think this is also what Steve was just talking about, or at least it's adjacent to it. We see turf wars between different agencies in the local context. So agencies that all have a hand in the maritime domain, maritime police, navies, port authorities, and so on. So this limits coordination, obviously, and it limits the effects of what is already short-term interventions. And these are some of the many things that policymakers need to continuously focus on so that we can study them. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. Christian.
Yeah, quickly on coordination. This week, on the 26th of April, NIMASA actually announced the creation of a shade mechanism for the Gulf of Guinea. And that's to some degree quite fascinating, because what we see here is, in essence, the copying of successful coordination models from one region to the other. Now we have Shade Med, we have a similar mechanism in Southeast Asia, the SAM from the IFC, and so on. But I think there's something peculiar to it as well, because the reason why Shade worked was because they developed a context-specific solution and they tried out things over time. Now, taking the same mechanism to a different region might not necessarily work, because the core idea of why it worked was the willingness to try out something context-specific. So I really look very much forward to see how that will be developing, and whether shade Gulf of Guinea indeed will make a core difference. Very quickly on the concept of blue crime, what blurs here in the background is that we also need new terms or new concepts to actually think the complexity of maritime security. And I think what clearly comes out of our discussion here today is that we need to think across different levels. We need to think across the land and the sea, consider the different actors, but also the interconnection between piracy and other illicit enterprises. And I think this is exactly here where the concept of blue crime gives us a new way of speaking about it, and also analyzing these intersections under a blue criminological enterprise, which then hopefully also makes better connections between the different disciplines that are actually interested in blue crime, and that importantly also includes those who are more in the environmental debate. So this is why blue crime as a concept is, I think, very, very important to drive the agenda forward. I thank you very much here and hand over back to Tim.
Thank you very much. Well, we are 6 minutes over, so I hope I'd like to thank the audience for being patient, but I hope it's been time well spent this afternoon. I've really enjoyed the discussion here today, so I'm going to close the meeting now, but not before thanking our presenters and panelists. Thank you very much for participating. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and the video of today's session will be shared on the SafeSeas website in due course. So if you would like to watch it in future, you can find it there, or if you'd like to pass it on to someone who wasn't able to be here. So thank you very much to our panelists. Appreciated.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.